Hi all, this is JC and I am doing my presentation on Langston Hughes, who was a famous American poet. Langston Hughes was actually born James Mercer Langston Hughes, and he is mostly known as a renowned poet, but he was actually also a novelist, a playwright, a columnist, and a social activist. He was born on February 1st, 1902 in Joplin, Missouri, and his family background is very complex, as both of his paternal great-grandmothers were enslaved African American women, but both of his paternal great-grandfathers happened to be white slave owners. He also had Jewish ancestry on his father's side and Native American ancestry on his mother's side. So he truly was the personification of America being a melting pot. His ancestry is just absolutely American. Hughes's maternal grandmother, Mary Patterson Langston, was also a melting pot of ancestries. She was African American, French, English, and Native American. Langston was the second child of Carolyn Mercer Langston, better known as Carrie, and James Nathaniel Hughes. His mother was a school teacher, and unfortunately, shortly after Hughes's birth, his father ended up leaving his mother and divorcing her, and he would travel, going to Cuba, and then would eventually go to Mexico, where he would live the rest of his life. This meant that his mother had to leave Hughes with his grandmother Mary, her mother, as she had to seek employment to take care of the family. So Hughes was predominantly raised by his grandmother Mary in Lawrence, Kansas. And Mary had a huge impact on Langston as she encouraged him to embrace his blackness and instilled in him a sense of racial pride. She also was a great oral historian. She passed on stories that her mother and grandmother told her, and they had stories that had been passed down to them. So she instilled in Langston this need to orally give out his history, which is amazing and explains a lot about his work. Hughes is quoted as being unhappy with his grandmother as he was lonely. He didn't have anybody his age around him, and so he sought solace in literature, which would eventually lead to his love of reading and subsequently writing. Unfortunately, Mary died when Langston was 13, and so Hughes had to move to Lincoln, Illinois to go live with his mother and her new husband. Eventually, the family would move to Cleveland, Ohio, and they would settle there. During high school in Cleveland, Hughes was an editor for the yearbook, he wrote columns for the school newspaper, and began to write his first poems, plays, and short stories. It was in Lincoln, however, that Hughes found his love for poetry, and he was even elected class poet. Hughes admits later that he believes that this title was only given to him because of the black stereotype that they can keep rhythm very well, which was deemed highly important in reading and writing poetry. So he didn't really take that title to heart, as he felt it was a stereotype and highly inappropriate. After Hughes graduated high school, he spent a year in Mexico trying to reconnect with his estranged father and convince him that his attendance at Columbia University in New York to become a writer was a great idea. Hughes's father did not agree with Langston's choice to become a writer. He wanted Hughes to do something with his life, to study abroad, and he wanted him to study something worthwhile, like engineering. He did, however, agree to pay for his tuition, but would never support Langston's career as a writer. Hughes went to Columbia University in New York until 1922, when he subsequently left due to racial prejudices. His stint at Columbia did introduce him to the Harlem neighborhood that would greatly influence a multitude of his works at that time and his future works. So it introduced him to quintessentially the love of his life, Harlem. Hughes traveled the world. He traveled to Africa, he traveled to Europe, and he did all of this because he got a job on a boat as a seaman. And it was during his travels that he ended up staying in Paris for a prolonged period of time, and then would subsequently England, where he would become part of the Black expatriate community. So what that is during World War One, when America came over to fight, they basically left all of the minorities on the front lines in Europe. They didn't bring them back. They didn't want to bring them back. And so these young black men settled all over Europe, in Paris and England. They settled everywhere, and they formed their own communities as they didn't want to go back to America, to the racism. And the beautiful thing about that is that their music combined with the jazz music that was happening during that time in Paris and all over. And when people would come back from Europe to America, they brought this newfound jazz that was just a combination of black music and European jazz music. So absolutely mind-boggling when I found that out. After his spell at sea, Hughes would go on to live in Washington, D.C. with his mother, where he would write his first book of poetry, The Weary Blues, which was published in 1926, 4 years after he dropped out of college. Hughes would then go on to enroll in Lincoln University, a historically black university located in Pennsylvania, where he would be classmates with the likes of Thurgood Marshall, who would eventually become an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. So Hughes was going to a very prestigious school for young black people. So after Hughes graduated, he returned to New York in 1929, and he moved to Harlem, and that would be his primary residence and home for the remainder of his life. So Hughes's first piece of jazz poetry, When Sue Wears Red, was actually written while he was in high school. And he was greatly influenced by a multitude of poets and authors, including Paul Laurence, Carl Sandburg, and Walt Whitman, who is pictured. Walt Whitman was a giant influence on Langston. And it was with these influences that allowed Hughes to portray the highly insightful and colorful lives of Black Americans that are often depicted in his works. Hughes's works were greatly influenced by jazz as well. And he is one of the predominant figures of the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s, alongside the likes of Zora Neale Hurston, Wallace Thurman, Claude McKay, Countee Cullen, Richard Bruce Nugent, and Aaron Douglas. The Harlem Renaissance was a very important literary movement that happened in the 1920s and 30s because it combined black literature and music and art. It was just an amazing movement of black art that had never been seen before in America. Hughes's work often appeared in the NAACP magazine The Crisis, and his famous book of poetry, Weary Blues, which includes arguably Hughes's most famous poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers, was actually first published in this magazine. Hughes was different compared to his other black poet counterparts, in that he refused to differentiate between his personal experience and the common experience of the everyday black American. His stories and poems were meant to tell the real lives of black Americans, which included their suffering, their culture, their love and laughter, and he often used the language they would use in his works. So his poems and his stories and plays were written from the perspective of the everyday black American. Hughes's poetry was also different in that while it was very in vogue at the time for poets of the 1920s to write about inward esoteric experiences, Hughes's works focused outwardly using language, themes, and culture, and he often did this and spread a humorous message, but a familiar message to anyone who knew how to read. He stressed racial consciousness and cultural nationalism that lacked self-hate in hopes to unite African American people across the globe, not just in the United States. And he was subsequently deemed the Poet Laureate of Harlem. His work unfortunately did dwindle in popularity after the 40s, as the younger generation of black writers felt that as they headed towards racial integration, Hughes's works were racially chauvinistic and out of date. So Hughes urged black people to be separate, to be separatists, to support one another, to put black lives first. And the younger generation at that time felt that that was not inappropriate, but it was setting them back. They wanted to be integrated. They wanted to be on the same level as the whites. And so they felt that separating themselves actually set them back. But Hughes saw the promise of communism as an alternative to segregation in America, and he actually wrote 2 volumes worth of work that centered around his attraction to communism. It has been said by a lot of biographers that Hughes was actually predominantly homosexual and used homosexual codes in his poems, much like Walt Whitman did. And Walt Whitman was a great influence on Langston. His poems were highly centered on black men, on virile, strong, beautiful black men. And so he never actually came out, as he was afraid of losing the support of black organizations and churches and didn't want to ostracize himself from the community. And he didn't want to change his financial situation. So Hughes died and never was able to discuss his sexuality, and he died on May 22nd, 1967 from abdominal surgery, complications from that, trying to help his prostate cancer. He was buried, his ashes are laid in a medallion in the middle of the foyer in the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in Harlem. And that whole section is actually named after him. So that is it. I hope you enjoyed my presentation. Sorry for any hiccups, and have a wonderful rest of your day.